do that, didn't I? Good morning. Welcome to today's Police and Crime Committee meeting. Before we begin, can I ask the committee to note the changes to the membership of the Police and Crime Committee, which were agreed at the Mayor's Question Time meeting on the 20th of January 2022. And it's as followed. Keith Prince, Assembly Member, has replaced Sean Bailey, Assembly Member, and Neil Garrett, Assembly Member, has replaced Nick Rogers, Assembly Member. Please make sure that all your electronic devices are switched to silent mode. Can I now ask our clerk, Lauren Harvey, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies have been received from Assembly Member Duval, for whom Assembly Member Clark is attending as a substitute, and Assembly Member Garrett, for whom Assembly Member Boff is attending as a substitute. We also have virtual attendance from Assembly Member Moema.
Thank you, Lauren. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out in item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? No, thank you. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 15th of December 2021 to be signed by me as a correct record? Thank you. Can we note the summary list of actions completed, ongoing and closed actions arising from previous meetings of the committee? Assembly Member Devenish.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted, as we had the Commissioner in front of us this morning, good morning, Commissioner, just to gently nudge you on the 20th of October meeting that you attended. You kindly agreed to send a written update on the allegations of electoral corruption in Tower Hamlets. Just to remind you, it's 100 days today to this year's local government elections. Could we have that letter from you ASAP, please?
Chair, my apologies to the Assembly Member, and yes, of course, we'll send that as soon as we possibly can.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner, I agree with what Assembly Member Devenish has said. I represent Tower Hamlets, as you well know, and these concerns do still remain. So I'm grateful that you indicated you are looking into it.
Okay, we look forward to that, Commissioner. We now move on to our main item of business, our monthly question and answer session with the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime and the Metropolitan Police Service. And today I'd like to welcome our guests, Sophie Linden, Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime, and Cressida Dick, our Commissioner of the MPS. So, I've been asked by various members if we could have an update relating to the Downing Street parties, Commissioner. So I'm going to start off with Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Deputy Mayor. Good morning, Commissioner. Commissioner, my questions are to you. Commissioner, I'm sure you can appreciate that the past few weeks have led to many Londoners feeling that it is one set of rules for the government and another for everyone else. Many constituents have rightly been angry about the perceived inaction of the police to investigate seemingly clear breaches of COVID-19 rules, and also the proximity of your officers to the rule breaking taking place at number 10 Downing Street. The perception that you're covering for those in power, however, has been building for some time. You will recall that I asked questions of Assistant Commissioner Nick Efkrel about Downing Street officers marching Sonia Khan, a junior special advisor of the premises, when ordered to do so by the government. The Treasury had to pay her off rather than face an unfair dismissal tribunal. Other instances that I raised with you included not investigating former Housing Secretary Robert Jenrick when what seemed like blatant evidence pointing to corruption was on the table, and of course Dominic Cummings' alleged COVID breaches when he was working for the government. So, Commissioner, as you are aware, official survey data shows that public trust in your force has severely waned in recent years. Do you accept, Commissioner, that these separate incidents have impacted upon this trust? Commissioner, if so, do you accept that you may need to review the way in which you and your police officers act in relation to policing the government themselves?
Well, thank you very much indeed for that question. We have known each other for a long time. We police without fear or favour. We police impartially, and we police in an operationally independent manner. I myself have, as you know, investigated more politically charged investigations and investigations involving members of the government, members of the civil service, and other elected officials, many more than any other senior police officer, I would suggest. And I've always done that and will always do that, as I say, impartially. I absolutely understand that there is deep public concern about the allegations that have been in the media over the last several weeks. I completely understand that. The vast majority of people have acted responsibly during the pandemic. Many, many people, including many Londoners and indeed my colleagues, have made huge sacrifices and they've suffered considerable loss during the pandemic. And as you know, also throughout the pandemic, my officers and my staff have kept going. They've put themselves in harm's way to tackle crime, to tackle violence, and to do their bit to help our city in the health crisis. Chair, if I may, I would like to just quickly explain our general approach before turning very specifically to the matters relating to Downing Street. We have, throughout the pandemic, adopted, as you know, the approach of the 4 E's, invented in London and adopted nationally. We engaged with people at the time, we explained the restrictions, we encouraged people to adhere to them, and as a last resort, but only as a last resort, we moved to enforcement. In general, we have not normally investigated breaches of the regulations when they have been reported long after they have said to have been taken place. And I'll like, if I may here, just quickly to explain why. It was never a blanket rule, but it was our guidelines that in general we wouldn't. And we've said that publicly on many occasions. Throughout the pandemic, our focus has been on what we could do to benefit public health. We police by consent, and people need to see that what we're doing has a purpose. Hence the 4 E's approach. And of course, we did issue tickets, and we did enforce with some really flagrant breaches, but most people, as you all well know, responded very well to our engagement and changed their behaviour. We do have finite resources, and even more so during the worst periods of the pandemic, when our officers fell ill, as well as other people. And our view was and is that it would not normally be a proportionate use of officers' time to spend their time bearing in mind the nature of the offences after the fact, investigating what could have been thousands of complaints. These are summary-only offences. The people who commit them get a fixed penalty notice. I think in general, the public would understand that we need to focus on violent crime and terrorism and other priorities, as well, of course, as doing our bit during the pandemic. But recognising that there might be some occasions where we would investigate retrospectively, we generated some guidelines, only guidelines, but guidelines that we have stuck to. And you will be aware that we have, on occasion, investigated retrospectively. Some of my own officers, a few, have received penalty notices when we heard after the fact that they had breached the guidelines. 1 or 2 high-profile people also, when it was plain that they had admitted and there was good evidence, they also, after the fact and a few weeks after the fact, received penalty notices. And the occasions on which we have done that have been where we were looking at something which appeared to be the most serious and flagrant type of breach, and where 3 factors came into play. Firstly, there had to be, of course, I'll add a 4th, there has to be some kind of evidence, not just somebody saying something. There has to be some sort of start point, some sort of evidence. But my 3 factors were and are: there was evidence that those involved knew or ought to have known that what they were doing was an offence. Where not investigating would significantly undermine the legitimacy of the law, and where there was little ambiguity around the absence of any reasonable defence. So in those cases where those criteria were met, the guidelines suggested that we should potentially investigate further and end up giving people tickets. We have a long-established and effective working relationship with the Cabinet Office, who have an investigative capability. And as you well know, they have been carrying out an investigation over the last few weeks. And what I can tell you this morning is that as a result, firstly, of the information provided by the Cabinet Office inquiry team, and secondly, my officer's own assessment, I can confirm that the Met is now investigating a number of events that took place at Downing Street and Whitehall in the last 2 years in relation to potential breaches of COVID-19 regulations. My officers have assessed several other events that appear to have taken place at Downing Street and Whitehall. On the available information, these other events are assessed as not reaching the threshold for criminal investigation. Throughout the pandemic, the Met has sought to take, as I have said, a proportionate approach. I should stress that the fact that we are now investigating does not, of course, mean that fixed penalty notices will necessarily be issued in every instance and to every person involved. We will not be giving a running commentary on our current investigations, but I can assure you that we will give updates at significant points, as we would generally do. And finally, I would just say, you mentioned a number of other matters that you are clearly frustrated about, and no doubt some other people as well. I know what you are talking about in each instance. I suspect it's not worth discussing them here and not appropriate. All I would say is I beg to differ. I am fully aware of the decisions that were made in each of the cases that you mentioned, Umesh, and I believe we did the right thing, and we will always seek to do the right thing.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Assembly Member Russell, if you've got anything different, but a question, not a statement, please.
Chair, I have very clear questions that relate to what.
Well,
the Commissioner
don't forget,
has just
we're
said.
only allowing 15 minutes for this.
I am aware, and I've got the clock running. Commissioner, you've just set out what was part of what was said in the 13th of January statement by the Met, that you don't routinely investigate retrospective breaches of COVID laws, and that you used a 4Es approach, which is to engage, explain, encourage, enforce at the time of breaches, and that you may review and consider significant evidence if it becomes available. Was there any attempt made to use the 4Es approach to engage, explain, encourage, enforce with attendees at any of the Downing Street lockdown parties while they were happening?
So I think you will understand that it's inappropriate for me to comment on that. We are in the middle of an investigation, and when we have investigated, then I'm sure the facts will become apparent. You shouldn't read anything into that apart from the fact that I'm not prepared to comment.
Thank you. It sounds like there was a culture of law-breaking parties rather than a single one-off event. We've heard reports of wheelie suitcases of drink clanking through security. Surely some officers were concerned about what they were seeing at the time. Was any concern raised with you or any member of your team about what was going on in Downing Street while the coronavirus lockdown laws were in place?
So you'll be aware that there are a number of officers posted in the surrounds of Downing Street and indeed what we call more generally the government security zone. They have a very clear role, and that is protective security. You'll be aware that the ones you see are all armed, and they have a job to do. In relation to anything they may have seen or heard or done or not done, Again, I'm afraid I'm not prepared to comment, but I can assure you that we are carrying out our investigations, and if that is a relevant matter, we will find out about that.
Thank you. The problem is that if people begin to think that the laws apply to everyone except the people who set those laws, then the police may struggle to retain that public consent that enables them to do their jobs. Are you worried that the apparent lack of investigation of the mess in Downing Street might be further damaging trust and confidence in the police?
So I fully recognise people have been very concerned about this. I think you will recognise also that in the explanation, I hope, in the explanation I've given, you can see that we have acted carefully, thoughtfully, and in concert with the Cabinet Office inquiry. I do need to say we work very regularly with the Cabinet Office team. Even sometimes in the most serious cases, they will carry out an initial investigation and then hand us material. And they have access to all sorts of things because they know the systems, they know the way things work. I am confident in the inquiry that they have done. I don't like anything that can potentially damage public confidence. Of course I don't. But I have to do what I think is the right thing in all the circumstances. And sadly, in policing, also recognise that sometimes some people won't be happy. But as long as we know that we have acted fairly, impartially, that we have done our jobs and we've done them to the best of our ability, then that's what we have to do.
And just finally, your investigation, the welcome investigation that the Met is now investigating a number of events, when do you expect to be able to report back on that?
So I can't give you a timescale, I'm afraid, at the moment. I just can't. All I can say is we won't give a running commentary, but in accordance with our normal press guidelines, we will, of course, update the public at significant moments.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assemblymember Pigeon.
Thank you very much. Commissioner, I don't imagine any of the parties were silent discos. We've seen pictures of people gathering in the garden over wine and cheese. As already mentioned, police on site probably would have heard drinking and talking in the garden, but also Downing Street in the area has so many CCTV cameras 24 hours a day. Will those form part of your investigation that you've announced this morning?
We will, of course, be going where the evidence takes us, and we have already done our own assessment, as you know, and we've been in a constant dialogue with the Cabinet Office team, so I don't anticipate any difficulty in obtaining the evidence that it is both necessary, proportionate and appropriate for us to obtain in order to get to the right conclusions.
Lovely, thank you. And could you just finally clarify, you talked about some parties that you're going to be investigating. Does this also include the alleged party at CCHQ, which we saw a photograph of?
So I'm not going to talk about, there's been a whole plethora of things in the media, as everybody is very well aware. I am not at this stage going to say which ones we are and which ones we are not. But I can say, as I have, that we are investigating a number, and there are several that we are not investigating.
Lovely, thank you very much.
Thank you. We're now going to go on to the very serious issue of the Stephen Port murders, and I think, colleagues, we should reflect upon the point that 4 young men lost their lives, and so serious questions do need to be addressed. So if I can start with you, Commissioner, what is your response to the findings of the inquest into the Stephen Port murders?
Well, firstly, Chair, if I can join you in saying how terribly sad it is that these 4 young men lost their lives, Anthony, Gabriel, Daniel and Jack. And I know that they are sorely missed by their families and many, many other people. The jury found that the deaths of the 3, as opposed to Anthony, could have probably been prevented, and we accept that finding. and that is, I think Helen Ball said at the time, a devastating finding. It is a matter of deep, deep regret, and I have also apologised publicly, and indeed have been able to meet the families of 3 of the young men who were killed, and am about to meet the 4th family also. So I have further apologised to them from the bottom of my heart. It is a matter of deep regret that we did not do a better job in those investigations. What I can say, and I'm sure you want to question me about this, is that since Stephen Port was brought to justice, we've made a large number of changes in the Met as a result of beginning to understand what had gone wrong. We have, of course, followed the inquest very carefully and have made further changes as a result of what we heard at the inquest. We are in possession of an Independent Office of Police Conduct report, which suggests further lessons for us, most of which we have very well in hand, but we're working closely with them. And we will, of course, be responding appropriately to the coroner's prevention of further deaths report, which has, I think, been, which is finished, but is not yet in the public domain. So we've made an enormous number of changes, and I'm very happy to speak about those. And we will continue to work to make sure that we have really high quality investigations in all cases, of course, but in particular here in the cases where someone has died, and that we work very, very effectively with all our public, but not least, of course, the LGBTQ+ communities, to try to ensure that we are fully culturally competent, and that we engage and communicate and listen and understand effectively, and that we continue to learn, so that we will build further trust and confidence, and particularly, as I say, in our LGBTQ+ communities.
Yes, I agree. Sophie, do you have anything to add to that?
I would add my also heartfelt condolences to the families of the victims, and of course, followed the court case very carefully, as well as followed the inquest very carefully. And as the Commissioner said, it is a really devastating finding of the coroner that the 3 young men's lives probably could have been saved. And that's something that clearly the families will have to live with all their lives, and we will also have to live with. One of the things that we, from MOPAC and my role as oversight and holding the Met accountable, have done following the inquests, I've written to HMIC and on behalf of myself and the Commissioner to ask them to come in and do an inspection into the way that the Met investigate. We are at the moment discussing those terms of reference with HMIC, and of course we'll be looking at the prevention of deaths report from the coroner to make sure that those the terms of reference are appropriate and pick up everything it needs to pick up. That's a really important investigation from HMIC. I hope they'll be able to start their inspection, in spring. And also, of course, the Commissioner has set up the review by Baroness Louise Casey that's looking at the culture in the Met. Clearly, there still are questions around homophobia and discrimination, and I hope that the review that is just getting underway by Baroness Louise Casey will be able to look at that, and we'll be looking at the culture of the Met, including whether there is homophobia.
Yes, we're picking up on that a bit later. Commissioner, you said you've made some changes. I mean, you've obviously, the inquest raised that the Met missed several opportunities to prevent the deaths of Port's victims. So what action have you taken already before any of these examinations come to part? What action have you taken already before you wait for anything to come through?
Thank you, Chair. Well, if I talk about sort of running into the inquest as a sort of first time period where we were making changes, so between the time of the murder conviction and the inquest, we created in 2016 a new policy on how we investigate unexplained, as it was then called, or non-suspicious deaths. And that produced a step-by-step guide for investigating officers, and that has been amended a couple of times since. We rapidly improved our knowledge of the way in which GHB and similar can be used as a weapon. We launched awareness training for officers, and we've shared that knowledge with policing nationally. More generally, we have been very active in work on chemsex more broadly, making sure that our officers have a good understanding of that. We now ask for a test for GHB in all cases of sexual assault where there's even a possible idea that a drug might have been used as a weapon, and in all unexplained or suspicious deaths, whatever the circumstances, we quickly examine for that. We have improved substantially the way we train our investigators from recruit stage right through to senior investigating officers, and many of the courses, including the senior investigating officers, include an input very specifically on what happened in these tragic matters and what Stephen Port did and what we didn't do. That'll be updated in the coming weeks. Very profoundly, we have changed our leadership structures and lines to ensure that our homicide teams and our local teams are geographically aligned and work much more closely together. What you see on a daily basis, because sadly people do die in London on a daily basis, is a much, much more active and disciplined co-working between the homicide teams, who will be called in for advice in the first instance if it is not seen absolutely, obviously as a suspicious death, and the local teams. And there is much better communication at all stages to ensure that where it is appropriate for the homicide team to take precedence, that they will. I think we saw some significant failures in supervision and in leadership. And so I would say there were some system failures and some individual failings, no doubt. And what they sort of combined to create was this terrible set of circumstances. So under my leadership, we've been focusing enormously on improving supervision and leadership. We've had a big programme of sort of leadership improvement. We also, during that time period, have been working much more closely with our LGBT plus communities. And if I perhaps focus on that for a second and bring that up to date, you will be aware that we now have our large cohort of LGBT plus advisors locally. These are all volunteers, very enthusiastic, very positive. And for example, on the East area, there would be 6 of those. And they are available to officers at all times, and they will put themselves into matters that they hear about to say, is there any assistance I can give you? We've been working very closely with the LGBT plus forums and with our advisory group, and they have been helping us very substantially, both in the way in which we engage with our communities, but also in terms of the training of our officers. So training on LGBTQ plus issues from recruit stage onwards has changed hugely since 2013-14. As an example, our LGBT plus network in the Met, who many of you will know some of them, again, very energetic colleagues, They attend every single recruit training course and provide an input to them, not just about, far from it, not just about being gay in the Met, but also about how to work most effectively with communities. During the inquest, there were some very specific things, I think, that came to our notice, which we would anticipate that the coroner will comment on, and we've been working on that very hard over the last few weeks. And I hope that we will be completing our initial 10 actions on those by the end of February. So we have changed some of our training on the role and expectation of sergeants and inspectors at special post-mortems. We have hugely increased the awareness of the role of the review group and when you should call them in and what they can do to help. I should say that our kind of organisational learning ability has improved a lot since then. I'm going to finish in a second, Chair, I promise you. We have amended some of our policies as a result of the inquest. There were some very clumsy, I think, phrases in some of our policies. For example, being very clear with people that the word family for family liaison officer includes partners, parents, siblings, children's guardians, and others who may not be related but who have a direct and close relationship with with the victim, clearing up some of the misunderstandings there seem to have been about next of kin. So some quite detailed but very important changes in our policy and our practice. We have, as you know, a huge technology set of changes coming in later in the year, and we will be completely changing our information platform to take on something called Connect. And it might sound a bit arcane, but it will make the job of the supervisor very much easier in terms of making sure that investigative actions which should have been done but don't appear to have been done or end up not being done can be spotted very quickly by the supervisor, and the requirement for sign-off is much sort of stronger. Okay. So that will deal perhaps with some of those questions that we had about follow-through. And then the last thing is just constantly explaining to people the need to be both clear about roles and who is doing what. We do very complex work, which is about teams, and it's about teams of teams all the time. And sometimes things do go wrong between individuals or between teams where someone thinks somebody's done something and somebody else hasn't. Yeah. And that has to be checked. And so we're working very hard on the sort of underlying culture. I'm very proud, as you know, of the vast majority of my people, and I'm very proud of we are a proud police service. We're a world-leading police service in terms of investigations, and so many people would say that in the modern age. This was not good, and we need to make sure we improve.
I think we all recognise that, but it was one thing after another that went wrong with this case. It really was, and the thing that concerns me is it doesn't matter what you put in place if the people following things up don't look a little bit further. I mean, the fact that those murders were not linked with each other, the fact that it was the sisters, really, of Jack that did the investigative work, and they are not investigators, is quite shocking. Mm. And had they not done that, one has to ask the question, who would have been next, which is alarming to all of us. You've answered, in effect, a lot of my next questions, but there's a couple of things that I need to ask you. Sure. If we talk about the drugs, you now know about that specific drug. Mm-hmm. Are you always updating information? Because there must be new drugs that come on. Unfortunately, I do not know anything about drugs, so I'm a bit hopeless, clueless, some would say. But, are they being updated to the Met the whole time so that toxicology can check that?
They absolutely are, Chair, and that's very important, and our head of forensics takes that really seriously, and we're very involved with a lot of national groups and working with the scientists and the coroners on that. Two things I should very quickly mention that you've triggered with your question, if you don't mind. One is we have invested much more in our analytic capability and our ability very specifically to link both sexual offences and indeed deaths. So we have more and more capable people working on that, which will undoubtedly help with what can sometimes, I'm not talking about this particular set of circumstances, but can sometimes be, a really tricky exercise to see that something is actually potentially or actually linked. And we had an example just last week of a very good case of linking a series of horrible offences actually against gay men, which was done by really good analysis. And the second thing to say is we now have, and it might sound a bit dull, but we have our head of profession for investigations who's at commander level and whose whole job is to improve the overall capability across the Met and make sure that whenever we get recommendations that we accept, that we get them properly implemented and we kind of look to the future. So we've got much more leadership around these issues now.
Okay, because it's not just capability, it's care as well. And it's the care aspect of this that certainly struck me, that had somebody, I'm not going to name any of the names of the office, but if they'd taken a little bit more care and looked at the videos and done all that sort of thing. The other thing I wanted to particularly bring out, you've mentioned the family liaison officers. Do we still have brand new officers that are family liaison officers? Because they're dealing with people at their most vulnerable time. They're utterly devastated at what's happened, with whoever or whatever their, the reason for them having lost somebody. Is it sensible to be putting brand new officers in that position? Because it does take a certain person that can cope with that, I would suggest.
Absolutely. Inevitably, it's in the nature of policing that it's perfectly possible that the first officer who speaks to a family may very well be a relatively new officer. You can imagine the circumstances where perhaps somebody turns up at a cordon and it's a probationer who's standing at the cordon. But when you're talking about trained family liaison officers, yes, I can say to you that they are all, with the exception of two departments, detectives. Now, they have to be detectives, and you can't be a detective without having had the full kind of training program. So you wouldn't get a highly inexperienced or early in-service person doing the family liaison role. The only two areas of the Met where at the moment we don't always have fully trained detectives, but they are fully trained family liaison officers and very experienced, is in our, I believe, road traffic command, and in aviation policing, but those are very experienced officers who are then taking on that role. The course that they do is now stronger and longer than it was, and we have a much stronger central capability in our central family liaison team, who are very active in going out and making sure that people are competent and keeping up with their continuous professional development. There's far more available to the officers in terms of continuous professional development as well now.
Good. I'm pleased to hear that, and I think especially Anthony's family were particularly treated badly. Sophie, if I can just ask you, following the findings of the inquest, what role can MOPAC play to improve trust and confidence in the LGBT plus community? Because it really has been damaged badly by this, quite rightfully.
Thank you. Sorry, apologies, I can't make my mic turn off and I'm not speaking. So we've clearly, MOPAC has a role, as we all know, around accountability and oversight of the Metropolitan Police, and also in relation to setting the priorities. You'll have seen from the draft Police and Crime Plan that trust and confidence is one of the key priorities. And what we will do, working with the Metropolitan Police to improve trust and confidence, is we're really looking at what those drivers are of trust and confidence. And one of the key drivers is effectiveness. So all the things that the Commissioner has set out about how they have put in improvements since 2016, improvements to investigation, improvements to family liaison officers, to analytics, to forensics, should help improve trust and confidence, because it should help improve the investigations and improve the outcomes of the investigations. But of course, I hope that the HMIC inspection that we've commissioned will also help along that journey of improving trust and confidence of the LGBTQ plus community, because they really do need to see, as do the families, that not only has the Met put in place these changes, but they have had the impact that they should have had and that they expected to have. The other issue around trust and confidence is in terms of engagement. The STRIDE strategy, the Commissioner's STRIDE strategy is very clear about focusing on disability and on LGBTQ plus communities to improve their trust and confidence, to improve the detections, especially in hate crime, but also to improve the relationship and the engagement. We will have oversight of how those advisors at BCU level are working, what impact they're having, and we will also continue to liaise with communities to make sure that what we hope is going to have an impact is having the impact that it should have. And we will track that through the public attitude survey, where we can very clearly break down the data into the protected characteristics. And we're also, as you know, boosting the public attitude survey. So we will be able to see where there are local issues, and particularly local issues around trust and confidence.
Okay, because obviously we're all concerned about the trust and confidence figures. They're going in the wrong direction. Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I intend to ask my questions in two sort of sections, and I'll explain why in a minute. But firstly, Chair, can I say this, that through you, can we send our thoughts to the families of Anthony, Gabriel, Daniel, and Jack? I know that the families, or some of them certainly, the Taylor sisters, are actually watching these proceedings as I speak. And can I also assure them, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of the whole committee, that we will do everything we can from this committee, from this institution, to help you in your campaign and to achieve fundamental reforms, the reforms that I know that you desperately seek. Chair, the family has been in touch with you, or the family of the Taylors did send you some questions to ask on your behalf, and they also sent me the same set of questions, Commissioner, Deputy Mayor. I won't go through all the questions which I received this morning from the Taylor sisters, the questions were signed off by the two sisters, signing themselves off as the broken sisters of Jack Taylor. One can only imagine their grief, ongoing grief. As I say, I won't answer all the questions. I won't set out all the questions because some of them have already been answered. But there are a couple of questions that I do think I need to put to you, Commissioner and Deputy Mayor. That firstly, if you just bear with me, all different police officers, regardless of rank, did not fulfill any part of their duty as a police officer. Do they not think that this shows an underlying issue such as homophobia? Now, no, Deputy Mayor, you referred to the issue of homophobia that will be looked at. But, Commissioner, I want to ask you this specifically. Do you think that homophobia played a role in hampering the investigation, the complete and total mishandling of the situation right from the beginning? And I'll tell you why I ask you this. Because Assistant Commissioner Helen Ball said at the end of the inquest, quote, "We don't see institutional homophobia. We don't see homophobia on the part of officers." To be fair to her, she does that say, "We do see all sorts of errors in the investigation which came together in a truly dreadful way." Now, what concerns me is this rush to dismiss the issue of institutional homophobia. Because you did the same thing about Daniel Morgan, that dismissing, that was your deputy, Stephen House, that dismissing the concept of institutional corruption in the MAD. Wouldn't a better response be to say, hey, look, we think that that's not the case, but we'll take a step back. We'll look at the findings of the inquest. We'll examine things in the cold light of day. And then we'll come to a considered decision whether there is institutional corruption in the MAD. I know it's a different topic, but I've got to make reference to what happened a few months ago when your office was before this committee. We will consider whether institutional homophobia did play a role. Why the haste to dismiss something so quickly? And as I said, that's a specific question that I'm putting to you on behalf of the Taylor sisters.
Apologies. I don't think we've been hasty to dismiss. I mean, again, just to say that I've spent my life as a police officer trying to bring justice and caring deeply about equalities, and caring deeply about providing as good a service as we can to all our incredibly diverse communities. And like Helen, I accept that there were errors. And as I've said, some of this was about systems, and some of this was about individuals, and some of this was about leadership and supervision. But I would refer you to the coroner's direction to the jury, that during that very, 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 very extensive inquest, all manner of evidence, and I suspect everything that could have been looked at, was put in front of the coroner. And I'm not going to remember her exact words, but she directed the jury that because of the lack of evidence around homophobia, in essence, they could not find that as part of the reasons. And so I do not rely on, but to some extent defer to the coroner. This has been examined in very great detail. We're not hasty to dismiss, and nor, Chair, I think, am I naive. But we don't actually, when we look at what happened here, see what, and it's obviously a contested concept anyway with multiple definitions, but we don't see institutional homophobia, and we don't see institutional homophobia in the modern Met. But I absolutely accept that it's possible that in many different places I have instances or people who are not, culturally competent or aware in a particular way. It's possible that people stereotype, that people are, allow bias to take part, and that includes in relation to LGBTQ plus people. Absolutely. I'm not dismissing the whole idea that we don't have more to do to be absolutely sure that we've got rid of anybody who actually is actively homophobic. We don't need them, and that the rest of our colleagues are capable. Sure. And that's one of the things, as the Deputy Mayor has said, that Louise Casey will be looking at. Okay. She will be having a look at the issues about how we relate to people from the LGBTQ plus communities, internally and externally. And I'm looking forward to seeing what she sees. I'm pretty hopeful that she will say, Commissioner, in the matter of the last 10 or 15 years, things are transformed in all sorts of ways. I'd be surprised if she doesn't find some things we can do now to improve even further.
Commissioner, I do have 2 or 3 questions. I know that my other colleagues have also questions, but I'm here today as an advocate for Londoners, not just my constituents, but for Londoners around policing issues. And I've got to tell you what the family said, that we as a family do believe it's down to the officers being homophobic and prejudiced, and that is why they fail the boys. But I won't push this point any further. You said what you had to say. So can I also ask you that, again, this is a question from the family. Does the police think that it is acceptable that not only did the Taylor sisters do the police investigation, they are now having to fight and push for a public inquiry? What are your thoughts about a public inquiry? And this question is to both of you.
So,
and this is a call made by Margaret Hodge MP and many other MPs, yes. London MPs.
You've mentioned Jack's sisters twice, and just for the record, my heart does absolutely go out to them. And as the chair said, they ended up doing, in the most awful situation, and doing an enormous amount of investigation and shoving and campaigning, and they still campaign. And I take my hat off to them. It would be completely inappropriate for me to say there should or should not be a public inquiry. That's a matter for the Home Secretary. What I have said is that if that public inquiry is designed to look at institutional homophobia, then my start point is I don't see that in the Met. But they are absolutely entitled to their opinion, and my heart goes out to them.
So a final question on behalf of the families, because they are at the center of things. So I make no apologies for putting these questions to you. They ask, do the police not feel that everyone should be treated the same, regardless of race, gender, sexuality, religion, and ethnicity? If the answer to this is yes, do they not realize this is not what they portray to the public? Time and time again, we see the police have failed the communities that they are there to protect. Is the Commissioner going to take responsibility for this?
So I'm utterly committed to having the best possible Metropolitan Police Service that treats people fairly, that takes equalities seriously, That is why, as the Deputy Mayor mentioned earlier, I've relaunched our Stride strategy, which is all about that. I personally chair and have done for the last 4 years our Diversity, Inclusion and Equalities Board. I will continue to do that. This is an area of very high importance for me, and improving people's confidence, particularly those people from communities where confidence has been damaged or is lower, is also, a huge priority for me. I care deeply about that, and yes, people should be treated properly and they should be treated fairly, and irrespective of how they present or who they are, they should be treated with compassion, which I think in this case it seems was lacking on occasion. The Met looked uncompassionate, and we're not, and they should be treated with respect, and on occasion we looked disrespectful, and we shouldn't do that.
And finally, Donna and Jenny Taylor have this to say. We would like to thank you for the opportunity for our questions going out. We would also like to say on behalf of our Jack and all the boys, they deserve so much better. They deserve so much better.
Thank you.
Sorry, Chair, I do have a couple of very quick questions, but I had to put those questions on behalf of the family. So I'll do two more questions, Chair.
Yeah, but you've already asked somebody else's question. Do you want to come in at the very end if any of your other questions?
No, my questions are very specific
well,
on the
can
IOPC.
You, no more statements, just a very quick question.
Yeah, fine, Chair. But these are important issues, as you yourself said, and this meeting, these are the main set of questions to the Commissioner and the Deputy Mayor. So, I can just get my paperwork in order, if you just bear with me, colleagues. Yeah, Commissioner. So, no officer was in the end found by the IOPC to have, quote, a case to answer, unquote, for gross misconduct in relation to the various failings outlined at the inquest. 7 officers were, however, given notice that they were under investigation for gross misconduct by the watchdog. Are you able to say whether any of the 7 officers who had initially served gross misconduct notices are now serving in higher ranking roles?
Chair,
you can get back to us if you don't.
Chair, I'm afraid off the top of my head, I don't know the answer to that question. Apologies. What I can say is, though, the investigation, of course, was utterly independent. The Independent Office of Police Conduct, they came up with the answers that they came up with. You'll be aware, perhaps, that since the inquest, they are clearly reviewing the material in the inquest. I will get back to you with the answer to your question.
And my final question, Chair, is to the Deputy Mayor, who haven't asked any questions as such. Deputy Mayor, the fact that the IOPC found there to be no gross misconduct case to answer in relation to the failings will leave many people questioning what it would take in order to warrant sanctions from the watchdog. In light of this, do you feel that the IOPC is fit for purpose, or is now the time to say, quote, okay, we need to start thinking about further reforming this body? As you'll be aware, Darren Rodwell, the leader of Bark and Dagenham Council, has written to the Home Secretary asking for a review of the IOPC as part of the overall review into the failings of the police in this particular case.
I mean, the IOPC didn't, in its initial review, find any case to answer for those officers who had failed the families and the victims of Stephen Port. My understanding is that the IOPC is in the process of reviewing the evidence that came forward during the inquest and is going to be taking decisions around whether to reopen their investigations and reopen the cases. I would have thought that the families of Stephen Port and Jack's sisters, who you've been asking the questions on behalf of, would want the IOPC to move quickly in making that decision and to reopen those cases so that they can have their questions answered, and the new evidence that came forward in the inquest, which the IOPC is looking at, can be viewed in the light of whether there has been any conduct issues, and that, I hope, will give the families some form of answers in relation to individuals. In relation to, it's not only Jack's sisters that deserve answers. Each member of and all their friends deserve answers to what happened, how it happened, and how it can be put right and make sure that this never, ever happens again. I think that the investigation, the inspection that we've commissioned from HMIC will go some way to doing that, and the review by Baroness Louise Casey is also an incredibly important review in terms of the culture of the Met and really looking at those issues around homophobia, misogyny and racism, so that families of the victims of Stephen Port can have those answers, because that is what they deserve and what we move quickly and speedily to give them.
Thank you. Okay, can you turn your microphone off? And Sophie, if you want to swap your microphone, and Steve, if you're out the back, if you can come and take this one away, then you can at least turn yours off. Thank you. Asking the IOPC to get a move on is always a good idea. I think the Commissioner would agree with me. Some of the decisions they make are far too slow for everybody's benefit. Assembly Member Russell, did you still want to come in briefly?
I do, very briefly. Commissioner, you said in your opening words that you're now testing for GHB in all cases of sexual assault, and that you're working closely with LGBT plus communities and with local LGBT advisors. In the investigation of the deaths of Anthony Walgate, Gabriel Kafari, Daniel Whitworth and Jack Taylor, the police appeared to display some ignorance around chemsex. What steps has the Met taken to fill this knowledge gap?
I think if we take ourselves back to 2013-14, our level of knowledge in the Met was nothing like what it is now, but nor was it in society and nor was it in policing generally. That I think is just a fact. So we have made considerable changes, as I said, forensically and in our approach investigatively. Through the various networks that we have, we are, I think, the sort of leading force in helping other forces to be knowledgeable and up to date around the issues of chemsex much more broadly. And we had a big conference on this not very long ago. We've done extra training for all our officers. One of the things I'm looking at going forward is when that needs to be redone for all our officers. And so I can say very confidently that it may not be perfect because, as the chair indicated, these things move quite fast. But our officers are far, far more knowledgeable now than they were then.
Thank you. That's reassuring to hear.
Thank you. Assembly Member Mahema, do you still want to ask your question? Because Assembly Member Desai touched on it.
I think the first one about the inquiry has been asked and responded to. I just wanted to perhaps ask the Commissioner, and actually the Deputy Mayor might take a view, whether or not you accept that the victim's sexuality had an impact on the way in which the investigations into the murders were conducted. And I ask that because obviously the families have a view, and that might be a bone of contention in any inquiries going forward.
So I would refer you back to my previous answer in terms of sort of active homophobia, institutional homophobia, these kinds of phrases. We don't see it when we look at the evidence in that investigation, and I'll refer you to what the coroner said. I standing here looking at what happened in 2013-14 with some things that clearly have gone very badly wrong in lots of different ways. I don't personally see anything, and I'm advised that nor do my senior colleagues, that is in the evidence that shows what you are describing. But, of course, I can't rule out that something was in somebody's mind that made them more careless or made them jump to a conclusion. I can't rule that out, but I don't think the evidence shows it in relation to sexuality. I don't.
Okay.
But others will no doubt take a different view. I understand that entirely.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Pigeon.
Thank you very much indeed. I've been listening carefully to what you said about this whole tragic case and these tragic deaths. I understand the point you're making about things like chemsex and how things change and fast-paced and so on. The thing that struck me, though, is how you said that you've now only put in place a step-by-step guide policy on how you investigate unexplained deaths. That seems quite a basic thing. This isn't sort of, I don't know, way back decades ago. To not have had that in place seems astonishing.
Well, I think in the past there have been guides, and it is, of course, as you say, sadly something we will encounter somewhere in London every day, literally of the week. Sophie and I see a morning report, which normally has 1 or 2, sometimes 3 or 4 deaths, which at that stage it is hard to establish whether very hard to establish, is this natural causes, is this, in some cases, an accident or a suicide, in some cases, is it a suspicious death? And I should say that one of the things the coroner, I think, will comment on, and we're very alert to, is that very terminology of unexplained, suspicious, not suspicious, has in the past been probably unhelpful within the service, and so we're tightening that up. And basically, the approach for any officer is assume this could be suspicious until it's proven not to be, and that's one of the things that is in the guide. But sometimes, it is often said, actually, and I'm not trying in any way to defend what happened then, but it's often said by my senior homicide investigators that where it is a clear homicide, it is often very much easier to investigate than one where you're not clear quite what's happened. And so, in all cases of death, we need to be very careful. We need to be very compassionate. We need to, work well with the family. But we absolutely need to investigate with an assumption in our minds that this could be suspicious until proven not. And the step-by-step guide, bear in mind this is sadly not something an officer will deal with, a frontline officer will deal with every day, or a local CID officer will be dealing with every day, but they will deal with relatively often. It was just an updated and clearer and easier toolkit to work with for people.
So there was already guidance there.
Absolutely.
You just clarified
Absolutely.
it, made it easier.
Absolutely.
Okay, because
Yeah.
that just worried me. It sounded like there wasn't anything, and I just thought, how
Yes.
could that be? Okay, you talked about supervision and leadership, which I
Yeah.
think is really important, and we see that so often. And you've talked about these volunteer officers in the boroughs, but what about borough commanders? What extra work are you doing with them to make sure they're showing leadership locally for the areas and the teams that they're managing?
Well, we've had a programme for the last 3 years called Leading for London, which is an investment in all our leaders from sergeant up to and including my level, where we have developed, obviously different people are at different stages, but we have given people development opportunities, and we have improved people's leadership skills. I think if we are thinking about the specifics in this area, the fact actually that we now have, or the area that's raised by this terrible case, the fact that we now have a smaller cohort. I know this is controversial, but with the fact that we have a smaller cohort of chief superintendents running the BCUs means that they are a much tighter team, and they are much more easily managed actually by their bosses. Not that they were awkward and difficult, just that you've got a really strong, powerful way in which to cascade, in a way in which to learn from each other, a way in which to improve standards together. And if we take, for example, the cascade that I mentioned, well, last time I was in the committee after the sentencing of the police officer who killed Sarah Everard, where we're talking about very basic standards and how we make sure that people really do understand what those very basic standards of personal professional conduct are. The BCU commanders, of course, had and have an absolutely fundamental role in this, and their job, of course, is to make sure that their structures are right, their systems are right, their risk management is right, their business continuity is right, they're keeping an eye on people's welfare. But they have a real role in making sure that, it's an old-fashioned concept, but we've been talking about it quite a lot. In policing, we talk about the ABC, which might sound very mistrustful, but assume nothing, believe no one, check everything. You don't need to do that as a supervisor all the time, heavy, but you need to, that is your job to make sure that things are being followed through. And at every level, it's our job to make sure things are followed through, and it's something that we're working with the BCU commanders around at the moment. You will be aware that at that time, colleagues felt that they had too much to do to be able to do everything well. And that is often a challenge. Again, no excuse for what happened, but that's a big challenge for the BCU commanders. They have to look at a prioritisation all the time. My job is to try to help with my colleagues, to help them to develop so they make really good decisions about those prioritisations. And they support their people when they have to say, enough, that investigation has to finish, we cannot do any more, but that they make sure that things that should be done are being done and that basic standards are adhered to.
Lovely, thank you. And we hear that so much on so many areas, that challenge, that professional curiosity, and I hope we do see those standards rising across the Met. I've got a couple of questions for the Deputy Mayor on this area. You've already touched on things like the IOPC colleagues have raised. Other colleagues have raised the issue that people really feel that they would like to see a public inquiry on this in order to regain confidence. What's your take on that?
In terms of the powers, duties and responsibilities that we have in MOPAC and the Mayor has, we have done what we can do. We've
Would
called
you
an
support a
HMIC,
full public
and we've got
inquiry?
the review of the culture of the Met. I think those two things will provide very strong answers, and we should wait to see the prevention of death, the coroner's prevention of deaths report. I think those two, the HMIC and the review of culture in the Met, will provide really strong answers. We don't have the power to call a public inquiry anyway, but those two will provide strong answers. I'm confident of that.
Okay, thank you. And I've been talking to various members of the LGBT plus community who have expressed concern about how City Hall and MOPAC engage with the community. Would you consider setting up regular London-wide engagement with key LGBTQ plus groups and organisations to ensure MOPAC and City Hall more widely are better in tune with issues and concerns in the community?
I think that's a fair challenge to ask us in City Hall, what are we doing to engage with the community? And it's one of the things that I have been asking as well, to make sure and reviewing our own structures as to make sure that we are doing that effectively, appropriately and regularly enough. I do meet with the LGBTQ plus network of the Metropolitan Police. I have met with the community in Barking and Dagenham as well through their invitation. But it is something we are looking at, and it's part of the structures that you know that we're reviewing the community engagement mechanisms, and part of the work of the police and crime plan as well is to make sure that across all our communities our engagement mechanisms are diverse and are representative and are really reaching those communities that we perhaps haven't reached as regularly as we should have in the past.
You mentioned the draft police and crime plan. LGBTQ plus Londoners are only mentioned twice in the whole plan, and there's no mention of steps taken to improve confidence in the police and those in that community. Will you look at that, and what other measures will you take to ensure the plan does address the needs of this particular community in London?
Certainly take that as feedback to the consultation, what you've just said, in terms of it not being clear enough that we are focused and we do have that priority on the LGBTQ plus community. I genuinely take that as feedback. We've just literally finished the consultation and we are now looking at the plan and we obviously have to, we will be publishing the finalised plan before the end of March. So we'll take that. It may have only had two references, but we've been very clear, and bedrock of the police and crime is about diversity and equality. There is the priority around trust and confidence, and that is trust and confidence of all our communities and all Londoners. And we've been really clear in relation to in relation to how we are going to track this through the public attitude survey, which we are really clear that we can track the trust and confidence, yes, of Black Londoners and women, but also of LGBTQ plus community and individuals as well in London. And we will make sure that our public attitude survey is representative and diverse. And we are actually, as I said before, we're increasing the numbers to make sure that it is much more, it is deep. I think it's a very good survey as it is, but we are going to improve it. We are also looking at a survey a little bit like the Crime Survey for England and Wales, which will look at, which will enable us not to only have the police crime reports, but also the experience of Londoners. So we'll have that as a rich form of evidence as well.
Lovely, thank you very much.
Thank you. Assemblymember Boff.
Commissioner, how many LGBT liaison officers are there?
We have 125 advisors across the Met, and as I said...
I understand the
yeah.
advisors, LGBT, I'm talking about LGBT liaison officers.
I can't tell you that, I'm afraid, off the top of my head.
Perhaps you could get back to us. Do we know whether or not Barking and Dagenham has an LGBT liaison officer?
And I would want to be confident before I come back to you. Sorry.
You were given the agenda of this meeting before the meeting. You know what it includes. I'm a bit surprised that you can't tell me whether or not Barking and Dagenham Police have an LGBT liaison officer.
What I can say is that we have refreshed and changed our approach both to hate crime and hate crime advice generally, and indeed to LGBT issues more than once, and I don't want to mislead you, so I don't know the answer.
I don't think, in my knowledge of this particular case that we're looking at, that was a hate crime. That was a crime. No. So therefore, what I specifically want to see is what action in the future would be taken by an investigating officer should they be presented with the cases that they had in this case, or the facts as they had in this case.
Okay, so I would expect them to draw on appropriate advice, both from within the community, from within our network, our advisors, and other resources that are available to them. What I can't do is tell you exactly what the disposition at the moment is of LGBT liaison officers.
Would you say that the situation of the number of LGBT liaison officers have increased since over the past few years, or have they been in decline?
And I would say there was a time where we relied totally on them. We now have all sorts of other structures and other ways of doing things. I can't tell you whether we've got more or less. We probably have less than we had in 2013-14, but it's a different way of doing things. We're much better in general than we were then.
Much as I commend you using the London, the LGBT advisory groups which have been set up, they can't be involved operationally, can they?
No, I have muddled you up, for which I do apologise. We have 125 police officers and staff who are our LGBT plus advisors, and I mentioned there were 6 in East area, and they are a vibrant group, they're a knowledgeable group, they're an active group, and they get involved locally, every day.
Okay,
we then have the independent advisory group, and they are a community-based set of people, and of course we only ask them to advise, not to do.
So those 125 are within the Met. They are Met officers.
Absolutely, and they're a brilliant bunch. If anybody wants to come and meet them, they're a fantastic group of people, and they're very active. And they are there to advise their colleagues and to support the BCU commander and any SIOs and anyone else who needs advice and support, and to reach out into communities.
I don't want to extend this much further. One small question. What is the difference between the role of an LGBT liaison officer and an LGBT advisor?
Yeah. So that was what I was referring to when I said we've changed. I will write to you, but that's what I was referring to when I said we've changed structures. We used to have a few liaison officers, and not very many. We now have a large number of advisors, and I don't know how many liaison officers we actually have. But what we do have is a very powerful set of internal advisors, and we also have our staff network. We also have our independent advisory group, and we have reference forums externally as well, all of whom, subject to what the issue is, will help in different ways in advice. And in terms of the advisors, they will often be actively operationally engaged on a particular case.
They will be?
They will be. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. That draws us to an end of this particular section. It could well be, Commissioner Sophie, that we come back to it. I know there's lots of questions, and I'm sure you'll want to be given the opportunity to absolutely assure us that everything is in place, that something as horrific as this can't happen again.
So, Chair, I was reflecting on this before the meeting, and as we see with the last answer, this development in the Met and our understanding of what went wrong has obviously taken place over quite a long period of time, and we have changes, as I mentioned back in the past, changes that are more contemporary and changes that may be required as a result of new understanding, Baroness Casey or whatever the coroner says, or the HMI for that matter. I want to bring that all together in a more coherent manner for you and the public.
Thank you.
So that I can report more regularly on, and in more, perhaps slightly more structured way than I've ended up doing today, on where we are and what we've done and what we intend to do.
No, that's great, and as long as it's going in the right direction, and I'm sure we will go back to it, because obviously we're as upset as you must be, Commissioner. Okay, we're now moving the next sections on to my nighttime reading, which is the force management statement, which is gripping in itself, and the first section is prevention and deterrence. So I'll start off with Assembly Member Devonish.
It's so gripping I get to start. Thank you very much, Chair. Commissioner, starting with you and then the Deputy Mayor, please, and please be a bit more succinct in your answers, because I think we need to make up a little bit of time after the last section. How does the Met's force management statement support the Mayor's police and crime plan, please?
So the force management statement, for those that haven't read it, is quite an extensive document, as I think you were hinting at, and it is something that we have done, I think, for 3 years now, as required by the HMI. We find it a very useful document, albeit there's a lot of work that goes into it, to assess the state of our capability, broadly speaking. It was delayed in its publication this last time, as you know, but in essence it comes out annually, and we try to make sure that it fits well with our other business cycles, our planning and business cycle. You'll be aware that we have our strategy, the Met Direction, which has remained pretty much consistent, a few tweaks here and there over the last few years. In my view, the force management statement works in a helpful way to shine light on different aspects of our strategy and to say where we are likely to have challenges in the future, or currently do have, in terms of skills or resources or whatever. And it fits usefully, therefore, also with the police and crime plan, which I regard as quite compatible with the Met Direction, which is our strategy.
Deputy Mayor?
I don't really have much to add to what the Commissioner said, except just to also to, you know, when I became Deputy Mayor, the Met were developing the business plan, and obviously the force management statement provides a rich amount of data and analysis that goes into the business plan, and that is from the business plan that we, you know, we take our oversight, and also in terms of our really quite extensive performance management and quarterly performance reports. So they all do fit together. I think there's been, and I think the auditors show this as well, there has been great strides taken in the last couple of years for that alignment between City Hall Police and Crime Plan and the Met's business plan and strategy. And they really do align, and we will continue to work together to make sure, and clearly the Met have been very much involved in the development of the current draft police and crime plan, and we will continue to work together to make sure that there is that alignment between the Met's business plan and priorities and the Mayor's priorities, clearly.
Thank you. Commissioner, how has the Met improved officers' understanding of ASB powers, and what impact is this having on the ground, please?
I think a huge impact, actually. Whenever I go out, I see the officers using their ASB powers, particularly the neighbourhood teams, in a way that I would never have recognised even a few years ago. We have some brand new refreshed guides, toolkits, and indeed very usable videos to ensure that our officers have access to a full explanation of the powers and how to use them. I don't use those powers myself on a daily basis, and I was looking at them in the last few days, and they are very good. We have a central repository available on our intranet, which everyone accesses regularly, with all the guides to antisocial behaviour available. So if they want to look in quick time, even on their tablets, they can look something up and use that. We have a really active way of sharing best practice and illustrating how powers have worked. And this, you know, these great examples by energetic, innovative, capable local officers. And we spread those around everybody else. there's a computer sort of system, as I would call it in my old-fashioned way, on which everything to do with antisocial behaviour, usage of powers is recorded, and that has some good guidance on it. So whenever you're inputting to that, you're reminded of what's available to you. And the last thing I would say, looking forward, is we are have just reviewed our neighbourhood officer training, and we are providing some extra kind of walkthrough scenarios to our neighbourhood officers so that they will feel even more confident in the use of the antisocial behaviour powers.
Thank you. And Commissioner, again, has the Met's ASB early intervention scheme proved effective, and is it used consistently across the Met?
So for those that don't know, it's probably you know this in some ways better than me, but many of you are working so closely locally with your teams. But it's a stepped approach to deal with people involved. And the idea is it's a preventative approach and trying to prevent future criminal behaviour by responding to any offending behaviour. Also highlights safeguarding issues, for example. It's a useful scheme. The ultimate aim, obviously, is to minimise antisocial behaviour overall and reduce the demand and cost to us and indeed other agencies and to the community. In essence, we have a series of warnings where intervention and diversion is offered at each stage, and then it culminates in the use of antisocial behaviour powers. It has worked well in general, I think. The key to, of course, all antisocial behaviour work really, though, is the partnership, and it depends sometimes, crucially, on intervention opportunities and diversion opportunities being made available by other agencies. It depends on a really good join-up between the local authority and usually the officer. But I could take you to many, many parts of London where people really do feel that it has had a good preventative approach, and the way in which we scale up, ending up with a community protection notice and potentially breaches of that, has really helped reduce antisocial behaviour in some areas.
But by saying that, is it being consistent across the whole Met, though, Commissioner?
I can't guarantee, of course, that it's absolutely consistent everywhere, I'm afraid, no. What I do know is that it's something that people, are vibrant about and interested in and trying to learn from each other.
Thank you. And my final question, Commissioner, to what extent are ASB powers being used to reduce violence in London, and what is the impact, please?
It's an integral part of our approach to violence because, of course, many people who are engaged in regular, what you might call antisocial behaviour, are also prone either to escalating to violence or involved in violence. And I'm thinking here perhaps particularly people involved in street drug dealing and similar. It presents as an antisocial behaviour issue in many respects. People hanging around, they're noisy, they're annoying, but they're also drug dealing. And drug dealing is intimately linked, as you know, to violence, and our drug dealing hotspots are our violence hotspots. And so use of these powers against, let me stick with that example, those who are engaged in drug dealing has been really powerful, and even against some of the more sort of entrenched gangs, it has been powerful because actually when you go up the scale, we see people A, changing their behaviour, and B, being subject potentially to really significant restrictions on their lifestyle, and C, very significant action if they breach. And so I would say that my teams, in those areas where they are high violence wards or hyper-local neighbourhoods, where appropriate, they want to use these powers, and they do, and they're very pleased with what it allows them to do.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assemblymember Clark.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner, the management statement says that the capacity within the Met to deal with issues such as antisocial behaviour remains insufficient. Prior to the estimated £1 billion of government cuts to police funding over the last 10 years, was the capacity to deal with antisocial behaviour at a sufficient level? And are you expecting that capacity to be at an adequate level once the new officers are delivered through the Officer Uplift program?
Well, we certainly, in my time, have never had quite enough to do everything that people quite properly expect of us, and that's just the truth of it, and that sort of remains to date. Actually, if you think about antisocial behaviour and crime in general in the noughties, I think you would have to say that our capability, in many respects, was less good than it is now, and secondly, that our crime rates were higher, and secondly, that antisocial behaviour was much, in many respects, you know, the failings of the police nationally and in London to deal with antisocial behaviour effectively was a very high profile and, you know, vexed issue. And I think we have all got a lot better, and we have been given powers. And I've talked about the fact that the neighbourhood teams, which of course aren't as big as we would like them to be, and you would all like them to be, I'm sure, have, you know, really set about using the new powers and really tackling head-on the issues of antisocial behaviour. And when we get inspected, you know, we were once seen as not at all good at this, and we're now seen as, you know, I think, good in our use, not just of the powers, but in general in taking on antisocial behaviour. Now, I know that probably within a stone's throw of here, there'll be some persistent issue which, you know, is upsetting residents, and we haven't yet been able to actually stop it. It takes the partnership on every occasion, and some issues are difficult to cure. The new officers are very welcome, and we're looking forward to the second tranche of the town centre teams coming shortly, and then more officers in some of our most high violence wards. Dealing with antisocial behaviour will be one of the things they deal with, of course, not the only, but it will be an important thing they deal with, and I anticipate that you will see, you know, visible change in relation to antisocial behaviour in those areas, and hopefully, because then some resources will be not required in those areas to be moved on to elsewhere in terms of response policing and that kind of thing, you'll also see reductions elsewhere. So we're very pleased, and I think it's going to be, you know, a step change in how some of our streets feel.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Ahmed.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Deputy Mayor. Good morning, Commissioner. Commissioner, the Met has said that it aims to widen its engagement techniques to increase confidence and satisfaction. Has this work been successful, and what evidence is there to support this?
So over the last few years, we've been constantly looking at trying to be more creative about the way in which we communicate, listen, engage, and indeed explain ourselves. That, of course, has come into very sharp focus in the last 18 months since the dreadful killing of George Floyd, and then, of course, subsequent issues which we have touched on here and discussed on other occasions. We have invested very greatly in you know, new people and new skills, and I think anybody, I hope watching from the outside, but certainly watching from the inside, would have seen over the last 18 months that we have stepped up and stepped up again. I think the reference that you are referring to is probably from our Rebuilding Trust plan, which is quite recent. So I can perhaps tell you some of the things that we are doing under that, but of course it's too early to say that they've had an enormous impact. So we will very shortly have a virtual summit building on the success of our Behind the Badge project. That's an initiative that promotes the work of local officers and gives a face to the officers. So we're going to have this virtual event, and we'll be using hyper-local influencers to lead the event, and we're hoping that these will reach communities that we don't find always easy to reach. Our problem, not theirs. We're trying to make it a lot easier for our officers to communicate and engage kind of consistently. So we're supporting local officers in that way and giving them more accessible tools. This isn't just about senior leaders you might see in the local paper or whatever, but this is about officers on the front line, those in neighbourhoods, safer schools officers, those kinds of people. I'm going out, maybe a small thing, but I'm going out on the roads shortly to get round all the BCUs and listen and communicate, and hopefully also be able to give one or two, but mostly listening exercises, key messages internally and externally about our efforts to engage better and rebuild trust. You'll have seen some big events like the one perhaps we did in Croydon recently, huge community engagement events, fantastic support from people in the communities there, largely driven by them. We're trying to replicate that elsewhere. There's one coming up very shortly in Central East. A big part of this is about being more open. We believe we are very open, but we know that people don't always think that about us. We are going out to do sort of some themed engagement exercises where our media and comms people will be there, and they will first of all be listening, but then on the key issues, making sure that we do by default get information out earlier and before we're asked, and just be as open as we can. Some of this is about using new digital techniques. And some of it is about very much face-to-face. So if you thought of the Met's digital platforms 3-4 years ago, they would have been very limited. We're now quite creative, I believe, not my world, but we're up there. Our recruitment videos, you may have seen, we're doing stuff on TikTok, we do stuff on YouTube, we're quite heavily on Instagram. We're much better on our narratives and our pictures now than we were just a little while ago. I know it's not all about digital commerce, but it is important, and we use people we believe will be credible and influential, particularly with young people. Use is the wrong word. We work with them to get engagement messages out, to get safety messages out, to get recruitment messages out. So that's just a flavour of it. I think too early to say what's the real impact of some of these efforts are. And of course we do work very closely with MOPAC in terms of their engagement role and try to complement them and be present when it's appropriate for us to be present at their engagement events.
You've given some really good examples of the kind of work that you're doing in terms of getting engaged, doing the engagement work. What would you personally regard as an indicator of success of those various initiatives that you've taken?
Sure. Well, obviously I'm very focused on recruitment at the moment, and we have our outreach teams out there, particularly in our black communities. We're growing. This is going to be a record year of growth for the Met, and last year was a big year, but this is a record year, and over and above the numbers we brought in last year, we need to bring in 600 in the next financial year. We'll only do that if we do some really personal engagement with people, and we actually can reach out to people. So that is a very important area for me, particularly within our black communities, our Asian communities, our multiple ethnic heritage communities, of course. Secondly, we haven't developed all our metrics yet, but I want people to be seeing the Met as a more open organisation, accessible, and that, of course, we know is part of trustworthiness. And I want people to feel that they as it were, understand better who we are and what we are doing and what our role is, which is often quite difficult in a crowded communication space. And overall, of course, what we're trying to do is build people's trust and confidence and their knowledge of their rights and when they should contact us and how we can help them. So I'm sorry I've given you quite a broad range of things. We're just in the development stage of our new communication strategy, and we will be putting some really clear and much more tactical metrics against that.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner, have the additional 650 officers that are earmarked to improve community policing been put in place? And what assessment has the Met made to distribute those 650 fairly across the capital? And what impact are the officers that are in place having?
Thank you. Well, we've so far put our first tranche of town centre teams out, and that was in December. And the remaining, so that was 12 teams. The remaining 7 will be launched in February 22, and then after that we are putting, I think it's another 150 into our dedicated ward officer, our neighbourhood teams. And we have used a reasonably sophisticated way, I think, of trying to work out where they need to be placed. Of course, by definition, there there are people who've got extra and some people who haven't, or some local areas that haven't. We have used, in essence, metrics around violence, which is our number one priority, and around demand, and about deprivation. And so that has been a lot of work that's gone into it, and that has resulted in I'm not going to read out the list, you'll probably be familiar with it, but the places that we have chosen. I think I've said this already, but just to be clear, I do believe that by putting them in there, you know, I'm just picking one off my list, Hounslow Town Centre, we will reduce demand in that town centre quite considerably. We will make that a better and safer place for people to go about their daily business, including, critically, women and girls. And by reducing demand, we will free up some response capability and perhaps other capabilities that may be able to go to some of the areas that haven't got the extra officers. Finally, you may know this, but the teams are essentially 1 inspector, 3 sergeants and 21 constables. It's a bit different in Westminster because of the nature of Westminster, and we are already getting very good feedback from partners and from communities about the visibility and action and change that people are seeing. And of course, we've got lots of great examples of particular problems being solved or particular crimes being stopped or investigated better than they would otherwise have been. But we will be doing as far too early to say what the overall impact is yet. But the key thing will be, crime down, confidence up, antisocial behaviour and violence reduced.
Thank you. My final question. We've heard from representatives of safe neighbourhood boards and others at a local level that low-level ASB issues are not being dealt with properly and are then escalating into more serious crime. We've also heard that one of the main issues in dealing with ASB and low-level neighbourhood crimes properly is the rapid turnover of officers based in neighbourhood teams who deal with these issues and engage with SMTs, ward panels and other local community bodies. This isn't identified as an issue in the forced management plan, but I want to know if these things are something that you are aware of and how and is part of how the organisation is going to tackle ASB.
So I certainly am aware that people who get to know a good dedicated ward officer, and there are many, there are thousands of them, really want them to stay and love having them, and building relationships is really obviously important, and building genuine knowledge and understanding of how an area works is really important. One of the things we do, which the Deputy Mayor keeps quite a close eye on, is we have a commitment to ensuring that they work on their wards as much as reasonably possible. We take them away for aid outside the BCU as rarely as we can. Notting Hill Carnival, of course, yes, so forth, but try to reduce that. But there is a challenge with an organisation that is growing, and that is one that you have at the moment a lot of new, very welcome, very diverse, brilliantly talented, but inexperienced officers who don't have, for example, driving skills or taser skills or whatever. And on occasion, we have to take a ward officer on a daily basis to backfill, and that happened too much for my liking last year during periods of really intense public order challenges for the Met. So officers who would have been driving the response vehicle come away and are in central London with their PSU kit on, dealing with difficult protests, and then somebody has to drive the area car tonight, and that's going to be the neighbourhood officer. And then more secondly, when you've got an organisation that's growing, there's a kind of pull-through of expertise and opportunity for these officers. So this is not them saying, I don't like it here, I'm tired, I'm bored. It's them saying, there's a great job over there I would like to go to, and I'm now really skilled. So a lot of our dedicated ward officers will head to the TSG. Not all, but many. Some will want to stay a lifetime, and God bless them, and thank goodness for them. But others will see it as something where they need to move on. I know I'm going on too long. Just to say, I do see it as a problem. We do look at it. keep an eye on the sort of average length of service and try to keep people there. We don't have a minimum tenure, but we do have some sort of reasonable expectations of people. I'm conscious we're not as good at it as I would like. I'm also conscious that, and this is something that is coming in very strongly, when a new person arrives, they must be introduced properly. So they must get to know, have education, if you like, about the local area and introductions to key issues and key people that is properly managed. And the same is true of BCU commanders, and I think we could do better at some of that.
Okay, Chair, I wonder if we could ask the Commissioner to provide some data on how long, on average, community officers stay in post.
Yes,
is that possible?
At some point, that's interesting.
Right. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you,
Chair.
Thank you very, very quickly, Commissioner. Certainly more officers out there will increase confidence, which is what we all want. And it was reported this month that the police in North Hants, Bedfordshire and Greater Manchester sent officers to every burglary to collect evidence and reassure victims, and it's seen a significant fall in burglaries. So do you think that's something that the Met should be exploring?
So I think I'm right in saying, yeah, I shall regret this if I'm wrong, but I think I'm right in saying that we have already moved to a position where if somebody asks us to come, we will. And this is something we do have under review as to whether it is, whether that will make a significant, it will certainly improve some people's satisfaction, I am sure, even if actually, practically, the officers are not able to do very, very much when they get there in terms of bringing somebody to justice. But the question of whether it actually reduces crime and will do in our current disposition is another matter. What I would say, though, is please note the very low levels. I know it doesn't feel like it to everybody, but the very low levels of burglary overall that we currently have, the big reductions that we've had this year compared with 2 years ago. We have bucked the national trend in terms of crime reduction in London, in violent crime and in other crime categories. And we are seeing huge reductions at the moment. I've set out to my colleagues very clearly that one of our priorities for this coming year is to improve our detections and bring more people to justice, including, of course, absolutely more burglars. If Nick F. Graves says to me, well, what we now need to do is exactly the same as this force or that force, then I'm very open to that idea.
Thank you. It'd be interesting to look at, and it, of course, does help confidence, because if police officers visit somebody in a road, very often those people tell everybody on their WhatsApp group that the police have visited them and are grateful for that. Thank you. That finishes that section. We're now going on to the Met Forces Management Statement, the part of which is managing offenders, and that's going to be started by my colleague, Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you, Chair. And yes, the Force Management Statement talks about serious youth violence, which obviously includes child sexual exploitation, modern slavery and child criminal exploitation, all of which are increasing. And it also, welcomely, talks about, rather than focusing on these offences being committed by children, it talks about the importance of that insight into why that child is offending, and sort of improved understanding around a child's complex needs and the requirement for a trauma-informed policing approach, and also for that to include an element of safeguarding. So my question for the Commissioner is, what are the key challenges for the Met in dealing with more serious offending and levels of violence amongst children?
If I may, I would like to start just by reiterating the fact that we are currently, despite the utterly horrific number of teenage homicides last year, on a strong downward trajectory in terms of violent crime involving young people. And I, of course, recognise that headline figure and those individual lives lost is an appalling thing and a priority for me, and I know for City Hall this year. But in terms of knife injury victims under 25, after reductions in previous years. We've decreased again this year compared with its comparator year, which is 1920, by another 27%. So that's 460 odd young people not stabbed this current financial year compared with the last one. And I could say some similar things in other categories. So I think collectively we are making progress. We really are. But there are many, many challenges, as you have said. And this will be, continue to be a focus for my commissionership, I'm sure, and potentially beyond. It is as much about prevention and early intervention as it is about enforcement, of course, but we do take our enforcement responsibilities seriously. Sadly, a very high proportion of our stabbings in the city and indeed some other serious violence are committed by people who are, appallingly, remarkably young. When those of you who've been out with the Violent Crime Task Force or been out with the violence suppression units locally, you will see that sadly an awful lot of the people that they are interacting with who are getting involved in violence are very young, sometimes young teenagers or even very occasionally less. So we have worked closely with partners to improve our officers' understanding of the kinds of issues that you've talked about, adverse childhood experiences and how they play out, making sure that we work as well as we can in partnership with our colleagues in education, in children's services, in the youth offending teams, and of course also with families. We are always very careful when we arrest a child or young person to try to discover if they have been exploited or whether they've committed it on their own volition, and that's an important part of our role. It's often not an easy thing to diagnose or a binary categorization, but it's important. Often we have challenges, frankly, in terms of getting evidence or from victims or witnesses if they are children, of course. Overall, I would say the challenge we face as a sort of London society is, if I boil it down to the three things that Alex Murray has mentioned recently. We have localized social media which celebrates and encourages often violence amongst other children and young people. We have our drugs markets, I've talked about that, some huge successes in the last couple of years, particularly under Operation Orochi, which has brought exploitative offenders to justice and safeguarded hundreds of children. And then finally, the far too high prevalence of carrying weapons amongst some young people. The latter, well, for all of them really, this is why we're investing in school-based officers, why we have our youth engagement teams, and of course why we use our enforcement powers. We do use preventative approaches like the knife crime prevention orders, and we've already talked about the criminal behaviour orders, which can be helpfully applied to children. And we're always working on a multi-agency basis. But these are challenging, very challenging issues.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to pick up on the pilot scheme that's been running in the South Area BCU, where officers conduct a home visit to engage with a child and their parent or carer to offer any interventions or diversions sort of through a community resolution process. What are the key findings from this pilot scheme in the South Area BCU?
So I'm really sorry, but it is actually slightly too early to give you the answer to that. We are dip sampling there and elsewhere about the use of community resolutions actually with young people. But in terms of that pilot, it's still running. It's got another 6 weeks to go, and then we will analyse the results. So I'll come back to you then. I'm not hiding anything. We're just not in the business of analysis at the moment.
Of course. So you're saying that it's going to run for another 6 weeks, and then how much time will you need to do the analysis before you can share anything?
They haven't told me that, Caroline. I don't want to sell them short.
Okay, perhaps.
I mean, I'll try and get early findings to you within you know, a month, say, of the completion.
That would be fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Colleagues, we're going to have to pick up pace just a little bit. Assembly Member Ahmed.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner, what plans does the Met have to collaborate with youth offending team officers, police officers, to develop training for the actual youth offending team officers, and what are the timescales, please?
So youth offending team officers do have had increased training latterly. So training in trauma-informed awareness, training in evidential decision making, so to make sure that when they make a decision about what's the best thing for a child who is in the system, if I can put it that way, that's consistent. Training in the criminal behaviour orders that we talked about, extensive training around exploitation, the national referral mechanism, that's for child exploitation and modern human slavery and county lines. They have a strong and constantly being revised handbook. They have also got involved in helping the setup of our sort of local scrutiny panels. They have monthly review meetings as individuals and as teams, where the job of their supervisors is to make sure that any training gaps they have are identified and filled. And they have regular professional development events, such as recently a youth-based professional conference involving the Prince's Trust, the Dalalio Foundation and others. And they are constantly being advised around what resources and opportunities for diversion engagement partners can give them. So, and last but not least, latterly we have introduced the use of community resolutions carefully with young people, and we've just been giving them some extra training on that when it relates to cannabis.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Very, very briefly, Commissioner, the Force Management Statement says that there's been a large increase in youths being released under investigation. So is there any work going in to make sure that they don't get into more trouble?
Yeah, this is a very challenging area. I must say, Chair, I'm extremely impressed by all your diligent reading of the Force Management Statement.
I love it. I
shall tell Sir
I'm
Tom
so sad.
Windsor, who will be absolutely delighted, because it hasn't raced off the bookshelves, it has to be said, but we do find it very useful. It's quite detailed. And now I've forgotten your question, Chair.
It's just basically with the people that are being released under
it's very
investigation.
It's very difficult. What we do is keep a constant watch on the number of people we have on bail, the number of people we have RUI'd, adults and children, and the length of time. When somebody is released under investigation, you'll be aware that there is no formal, of itself, mechanism to put any order on them or any formal expectations on them. But whenever a young person is arrested, the fact that they have been and what it was for is made known to partners and to children's services, and there should then be a follow-up action between us to try to make sure that they're not, as you say, getting into further trouble. We are held back, is probably the right word, sometimes by the length of time it takes to do the digital investigation and get the evidence back, very often by the time in which it takes to get statements from partners, from doctors and others, busy people. It's not their highest priority. We are held back then by the fact that we now have to create a full file before we can get a decision from the CPS. That full file has to be absolutely full rather than, well, the doctor will give us a statement in 3 months' time, we know that. And so sometimes there is a lot to do before we can make a decision. And we would like, of course, to reduce that time, and that's one of the aims we have, is to try to reduce that time, and also, as you say, to get greater insight and, for want of a better word, control for the young person when they are released. I can't say that it works perfectly. With those who we know are at high risk and are well known to the system, then there is an enormous amount of activity after they are released to try to ensure that we take timely action, and that others, we work with the family, we work with children's services and others to try to reduce the chances of them getting involved. But the tragedy is, as you well know, a far too high proportion of boys who get stabbed or stab, kill or be killed are already within, well known to the agencies, always pretty much, and secondly, often currently released under investigation or even on bail for something.
Yep, it's a real problem. Thank you. And our last question from Assemblymember Maima.
Thank you, Chair. What plans does the Met have in place to deal with anticipated demand in managing registered sex offenders over the next few years, including returning sex offenders? And that is to the Commissioner.
Thank you very much. So we currently manage over 6,000 registered sex offenders. That number has been growing, and sadly I think it's quite likely will continue to grow. It's in the nature of the way the system works, really, that it's pretty rare for somebody to have their registration taken away, and it's a one-way system. Every time someone who commits a serious sexual offence goes to court and is dealt with, they may likely to get an order, and I'm very aware of that. What we have done recently and are currently doing is try to make sure that on average no officer is managing more than 50 offenders, and so we keep an eye on that average but also the outliers. Some boroughs, as you know, have many more per head of population than others, and some have more high-risk offenders as a proportion than others, and it's the high and medium risks that take huge amounts of work. So we try to keep the ratio right. We have, as part of our public protection plan, been paying attention to the skills of those colleagues and making sure that they are properly, not to suggest they weren't, but that they're keeping up to date and they're properly skilled. We have been working with the Home Office and the government to try to make sure that any law changes are sort of practical and useful, and it isn't all dependent on the officers who manage so-called the sex offenders in the jigsaw teams, but also improving the awareness of other colleagues as well. The key thing that we have done, which has made their lives a lot easier recently, is two digital initiatives. We've launched a new remote internet monitoring service where we use a private contractor to monitor the internet use of an RSO, where we've got a court order that allows us to do so. It used to be a manual process. That saved us about £2 million in officers' time. And in 2021, we equipped them all, which has been a huge success, with a digital triage tool to replace manual searches of the internet. And this has begun to save time at visits. And we've also digitally enabled them in other ways so that they don't have to keep going back to the office and whatnot, so they're more flexible and more mobile. So looking forward, we want to continue with the digital savings and efficiencies, if you like, and greater effectiveness, and working with others, obviously, long term, to try to reduce sex offending overall. But we have got to just keep a real eye on the numbers and the ratios. And I think, as with one or two other issues, I sit here with a heavy heart saying this is something which is going to take a bigger proportion of police time in 5 and 10 years' time than it does now, potentially, just because it's a growing cohort. And we don't have, to go to the question, we do not have a specific plan for 5 years' time, what we think the level of resourcing will be required to be. And we've been working really a bit hand to mouth and now just looking forward a couple of years.
Okay. So just briefly, Chair, last April the government committed to strengthening the MAPA statutory guidance to include sections on domestic abuse and stalking to ensure that agencies took steps to identify perpetrators in order to manage the risks that they represented. So just to the Deputy Mayor and to the Commissioner, have you had any indication from the government of when they intend to do what they said they would do last year? and maybe update us on what the most serious domestic abuse perpetrators, how they're managed. And if you haven't, if you could write back, that'd be really helpful.
I'm not aware that we've had any indication at all, so I'll have to get back to you on that.
Okay. And Commissioner, is that the same in your case as well?
Yes, I don't know. I don't know when that's coming. I would just say, I think I've exemplified this already, but it is another example of where there is a shift towards a role for the police in managing offenders after the fact,
right.
and risk, so-called risk management, which is really good in theory and makes total sense, of course. We all want to do that, but it depends crucially on partners having the resources to do their bit of the job. And secondly, every hour we spend on making sure that somebody is supposed to be complying with this, that, or the other is complying with that, is an hour not spent arresting somebody else. That's not a complaint. I'm just saying we have we have an increasing responsibility here. When people wonder why, we're stretched, that's one of the areas, that's one area where we're really, really stretched. Now, of course, if you can prevent somebody from committing a serious offence by managing them well, you save a lot as well. I get that too. But I'm getting a bit philosophical here. The role, we need to be careful about the role of the police in all these, in the future, in these kinds of, could you please manage all that risk that cohort of offenders presents, in my view.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assemblymember Pigeon.
Could I just pick up on that? It's a really interesting discussion. Your point about using a contractor to remotely manage internet access of these offenders. Are you able, I think, to provide now or in writing examples of where that's not just led to, obviously it's led to reduced officer time dealing with this, which has made a saving, but actually has led to further prosecutions and stopped offenders behaving in such a way or going further?
I'll certainly come back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, and that finishes that section. We're now talking again about the Met Force Management Statement on managing serious and organised crime. It's going to be started off by my colleague, Assemblymember Devonish.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner, do the Met's major investigation teams have enough officers to meet demand? Are they fully staffed with experienced officers, please?
So we have in our specialist crime teams, teams focused on homicide who are primarily reactive. Of course, they do proactive investigations. And then we have our serious organised crime teams who are primarily focused, if you like, on the front foot and proactively. They both have been carrying some vacancies, but we are now able to fill them up more. Secondly, in our restructuring that we did 3 years ago to create the Specialist Crime Command, partly by bringing them closer in their hubs to the local teams, as I described, but also through all sorts of other things, we have been able to make them, I would say, very much more efficient and very much more effective. Our homicide teams are busy, but less, they won't thank me for saying this, but less stretched than they were 18 months ago. And that's because we've boosted the team. So we had to create another couple of teams a couple of years ago. They are busy, but they get a over 90% detection rate at the moment in the main, and they're doing really well. Our proactive teams eat up work. They get fantastic results every day of the week, and there is very much more work out there for them than they are able to do. But when you turn to their results in the last couple of years, it is utterly extraordinary, not least against serious organised criminals and the suppression of gangs and the volume of guns we've been taking off the street and the reductions in serious violence as a result.
Thank you. I'm going to go on to teenage homicides. I'm just going to start by reading page 145 of the FMS that says homicide offenders are usually known to the police, with 69% having been arrested in the 12 months prior to homicide. 30% of accused have been arrested for drugs offences, 24% for violence, 20% for possession of weapons, and 9% for robbery. So the question is, the record number of teenage homicides in London in 2021 is of course shocking to all of us. The Met has identified that gangs and county line clashes may be driving these homicides. What actions are you taking to prevent more of these deaths? And perhaps page 145 gives you a clue.
145 of the FMS. I'm so sorry, Mr. Devenish, I didn't actually bring it with me. I know, sorry, I had it in the car. I've spoken at this committee before a lot about what we are doing and what we have done and what we have achieved. So if you start with serious organised criminals, you'll be aware of Operation Venetic, and that was called Eternal in London. We've arrested nearly 650 people in that top end serious organised criminals. Never been done in London before. That's resulted in over 500 being charged, 79 of whom have been convicted, and they've already got over 1,000 years of sentences as a result. We've seized over 1,000 kilograms of cocaine, loads of heroin, 45 guns, nearly 20 million pounds of cash in that alone. And we've accounted for a very large part of the country's Operation Venetic results. In addition, our organised crime partnership, which is a partnership team, small team that works within the NCA, on the same operation, they've had over 90 arrests, 75 charges. And again, drugs and guns in large quantities. So that work is taking the wind out of the sails of many, many, many of the people at the top end. These are people who are importing drugs, importing and distributing firearms, some of whom, not all of whom, are absolutely ruthless in setting out to, if necessary, have people killed, and we're getting them locked up. Come down a level. We've been working extremely hard through the proactive teams I talked about, but also with the Violent Crime Task Force and to some extent the Violence Suppression Units and the whole of the Met against our gangs, being better informed about the most harmful gangs, targeting them as individuals and as groups in local areas, getting real ownership locally of those gangs, and constantly suppressing their activity as much as we can, bringing record numbers of drug dealers to court, and also, as I've mentioned, taking huge numbers of guns off the street. Active, lethal, nasty firearms, at least one a day, every day, taken off the street. That's what's resulted in lethal barrel discharges being down this year by over 20%. Again, on last year of 2019-20, and. That's lower than the level it was in 2010 or 2012. And we now account for a very much smaller proportion of firearms discharges in the country than we once did. So I'm really pleased with that work, and I think we're on a very strong trajectory. I've mentioned knife crime, which has been coming down, gun crime generally coming down, knife crime under 25 coming down. I'm afraid when I was just flicking through my pages looking at our latest analysis, it's very similar to what you described in terms of the profile of our victims and indeed our offenders of homicide. Tragically, getting younger overall, more teenagers proportionately, more street-based, nearly all boys, and very tragically, even more concentrated sort of density, if I can put it that crude way, within our black communities. I do believe the work we have been doing on enforcement, which is what I've been talking about, has been having a big impact. And then there's all the work that the BRU partners and we have been doing in relation to diversion and early intervention. I mentioned it before. I think we're doing the right things. I think we're getting a better understanding all the time. And our high-profile presence in the hotspots, partly through the town centre teams and other uniform officers like our violence suppression officers Also, of course, our predatory offender units, primarily or entirely focused on those who are predatory towards women and children, getting them locked up quickly. I think we are absolutely doing the right things. We're getting more resources, and I'm confident that this trajectory is going to continue in the right way. Of course, I wish there wasn't a single teenager killed in London, and we want to reduce that number passionately. Every single one of my officers cares about that.
Thank you. Page 152 of the same document says there are 165 suspended homicide investigations. Why is this, please, and what is being done to get these investigations live again?
So I don't know what the number is now, but on occasion and at any one time, we will suspend an investigation where there is, thank you, nothing sort of obvious that is going to be lost by that, and where we have higher priority, newer, usually not always, but opportunities in other homicide investigations. So we are always, sounds horrible, but we're always managing a moving kind of cohort. If you speak to any of my senior investigating officers, they will have very current investigations going through court at the point of sentencing, and of course the timescale between charge and sentence is now very narrow, so they have to focus on that. They have to focus on their custody time limits. They have to focus on their getting the forensics back on those immediate and high priority things, because if they don't, then that case is going to be lost. We'll know that the offender with Cressida and Sophie, and they're walking out of custody and they're not being convicted. That cannot be allowed to happen. These other cases are ones where they are more complex and perhaps older, and so each senior investigating officer will be carrying some cases from the past. These are ones where we've done a forensic review and it has indicated there may be an opportunity we didn't think we had, or some intelligence has come in. As long as that is not urgent and high priority, the case might remain suspended until they can do it. But this is the skill of the senior managers and the senior investigating officers to constantly prioritise and reprioritise to try to get justice for everyone, because all families, whoever they are, where there is a possibility of bringing somebody to justice, deserve that, but they have to manage that all the time. Of course, I'm sure my homicide teams would like even more resources, and they would say they could get through some of those suspended operations faster. Sometimes something is suspended and we go back to it for 1 year, every other year, and nothing happens during that period. Then an opportunity arises and we bring people to justice. And as you know, we quite often bring people to justice now 5, 10, 15 and 20 years ago, and that's a good thing.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor, did you want to add anything in terms of the record number of teenage homicides last year, please?
Well, I would reiterate what the Commissioner said, and also the Mayor has said many times of, what a tragic record we've reached in London in terms of 30 young teenagers losing their lives. And notwithstanding that, to remember that underneath that we are seeing reductions in knife crime with injury for under 25s. What I would add to what the Commissioner said in relation to, well, what are we doing about this, is that myself and MOPAC and the VRU and right across City Hall are convening partners regularly on this matter to look at that analysis, not just in the force management statement, but the analysis, more newer analysis in terms of victims and offenders as to what else can we be doing. Are there any gaps? Is there anything we should be enhancing? Where are the particular areas of London where there are particular issues, and what we can do to work in partnership? That's a regular meeting that we have, that I either chair or the Chief Executive of MOPAC chairs, with our partners, with probation, with the Youth Justice Board, with the London councils, and obviously with the Violence Reduction Unit and with the Metropolitan Police. I think that focus is really helping in terms of supporting the Met and the enforcement tactics that they are undertaking, and really looking at the areas of London and the individuals who are most at risk. There's still some work to be done as to how far you really can hone down the areas, but how far you can really hone down in terms of individuals. Because yes, many were involved in the criminal justice system already, but when you look at the numbers involved in the criminal justice system, what protective measures can you put around those that are the most vulnerable? What can you do with youth offending teams or the boroughs or with community groups to really support those young people who are vulnerable, who are at risk, and support them not to get more involved and support them to stay safe as well?
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Colleagues, we need to pick up speed again, please. Assemblymember Ahmed.
Thank you very much, Chair. This is a question for you both. Last year was a truly tragic year in terms of the number of young people who were murdered across the city, and that's a personal tragedy for every single one of those families. The Commissioner, you earlier, however, voiced optimism about the clear fall in the number of young victims of knife crime. And in recent years, whilst this has been ongoing, it's been ongoing since 2018, so clearly there's a downward trajectory for this. In both your opinions, what has led to this fall, and can you explain why, as yet, there's been no correlation between this and the number of youth homicides in London? I wonder, Deputy Mayor, if you could start.
So in relation to what's driving the teenage murders at the moment, I think the Commission's already talked about the analysis and the professional judgment of Commander Alex Murray around some of the use of social media locally.
Sorry, Deputy Mayor, would you mind speaking a little bit closer to your mic? Thank you.
Sorry, some of the use of social media, the drugs market, and the prevalence of young people carrying knives. Now, clearly, that's a symptom of young people carrying knives, and rather than we need to drive down in terms of the cause of those young people carrying the knives, and that's very much what the Violence Reduction Unit is doing at the moment. Really looking at what the drivers are, and in the same way as I've answered Tony Devonish's answer, really looking at what we can do to support those young people. One of the things that I didn't intervene on when Caroline asked the question around the challenges for the Met in relation to serious youth violence, I think one of the things the Commission didn't pick up on is actually coming out of COVID, there is a real serious challenge because the vulnerabilities of young people have been exacerbated because of COVID, because of those young people who were who were most in need of being in full-time education, were the least likely to be in full-time education, those who were most in need of having their vulnerabilities picked up were the least likely to have their vulnerabilities picked up. And you can see it in the referrals because the schools were not open in the way that they could be. Services weren't functioning in the way that they have been functioning. I think that's a huge challenge going forward in relation to picking up on the vulnerabilities, and one of the things that we really are looking at in terms of teenage murders around what more can we do to work together, and how we can work with government to put the right services in place for London.
Thank you. Commissioner.
Thank you. Well, just to say that thank you for observing the trend, which, as you say, does go back to 2018, which was a horrible year in many respects. And to say that, latterly we have been bucking very considerably, either well ahead of or bucking the national trend. So you'll find many, many cities in this country that can't say what we're saying about the reductions that we have seen. We're also bucking the international trend, to take to a large extent, to take the Deputy Mayor's point. You look across all the big American cities, and violent crime, firearms crime, and murders of all sorts, and stabbings, and goodness knows what, has gone through the roof. And it hasn't here. We have continued with, as we've begun to not come out of COVID, but have a kind of different way of managing COVID and different levels of COVID, we have continued with our reductions. And that's one of the things that gives me optimism, despite the extra challenge that Sophie rightly identifies. So I think I've said, more resources has been really welcome, initially from the Mayor and then from the government. We've been able to create our violence suppression units. We have our very strong violent crime task force. We have got better, I think, in our specialist crime work in the ways I've described. And I think that has had a real impact. In addition to the diversion work that others and we do, like divert in our custody suites, and some of the work we've done to improve information coming in from the communities, for example, our Hard Calls Save Lives campaign. So we've been, I would sort of characterise it as very clearly, this has been and remains the #1 priority for Met people under my commissionership. There is an absolutely unrelenting focus on what can we do to reduce violent crime as it affects young people, and in particular, how can we reduce teenage homicides? Unfortunately, when you look at some of the teenage homicides, latterly what you do see, not absolutely everyone, but an awful lot of them, you do see that this is a group activity. These are, not always pre-planned, but certainly very violent, very vicious, and very determined attacks, often by a group. And so Sophie's point about people and places is vital. You know, you don't set out to go and do that today if you've not done something similar or before together. You know, it's not an easy thing to do, to go and to show such horrific levels of aggression and violence. And so our unrelenting work against drugs, against gangs, against the higher level serious organised criminals, together with all the presence and visibility that we're now able to create through new resources, and being there at the right time, in the right place when something's just happened to arrest people. You'll have seen the horrible incident in Selfridges the other day. We made an arrest straight away. You know, maybe 3 years ago we wouldn't have been able to. Made 3 arrests actually. This is important, and we are utterly focused on violent crime and trying to get our young people away from it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you, Chair. Question is to the Commissioner. We're looking at organised gang. How many organised crime gangs are currently operating in London, and what are your key priorities for tackling these and disrupting their operations, Commissioner?
So we have a concept called high harm gangs, and these we've identified 59 of the most dangerous, causing the greatest harm. That links to their serious violence, their drug supply, county lines, and firearm discharges. We have mapped them and looked at them as though they were, as it were, old-fashioned, proper, organised crime groups. And then we have a multifaceted approach to them, looking at how we don't just bring them to justice, but how we absolutely disrupt their activity, how we divert those who are on the edges of getting drawn in or already drawn in, how we use court powers and other powers to best ability to restrict people's lifestyles. Sometimes, for example, it's very helpful for a young person to have a restriction on their lives which says to them, you can't associate with these people, or you can't go to that area, because they're then able to say to the gang that's bullying them, I just can't, I'm not coming. And so it's a sort of sophisticated top to bottom approach. We have recorded what we call disruptions of gang activity, again at record levels this year. And we are always looking to see how, you know, there are a lot of gangs, sadly, in London, in the city, not alone, but going for the highest harm ones and really trying to disrupt and smash up their activities, and then making sure that at all times we're trying to reduce the harm to individuals who are on the edges or involved with those groups, including girls, and being quick to recognise the threat that they may pose. So, you know, it sounds easy taking a gun off a street every day. I can tell you it really isn't. And it requires brilliant intelligence work. It requires brilliant decision makers. It requires very brave, usually firearms officers, and colleagues who are absolutely on it 24 hours a day, scanning what's happening, looking at where they can, getting intelligence, looking at social media, seeing who's angry with who, what's going to happen next, being in the right places at the right times. I think if you were to speak, to many of the gang members in London, they are hugely aware that the focus and ability of the Met now is very much stronger against them than it was, sadly, able to be a few years ago.
And the Violent Crime Task Force, also at the BCU level,
yeah.
Do you think they have sufficient support?
So the Violent Crime Task Force are essentially a pan-London resource. However, they are deployed very, very locally, and their role is to work alongside other local teams to really understand the challenges of the area, the hotspot places, and indeed to get to know the individuals who are most likely to be at risk of being a victim or an offender. I think I'm right in saying that the Violent Crime Task Force now has about 330 odd people in it. That includes Operation Venice, who you'll remember are people who've reduced hugely moped-enabled robbery. And they have been a very important part of our huge reductions in robbery over the last couple of years as well. I think they are probably at the capacity they should be at, and they're very highly motivated and they're doing a great job. Doesn't mean if I had twice the size, we couldn't give even more to each BCU. Of course we could. We also have the violence suppression units who are highly local, and they are primarily in uniform. They are out problem solving, they're out doing partnership working, they're out getting to know very well their local at-risk people, and they are newer, and again, I'm sure they would like to be bigger. There's always more work to do, but I'm content with their levels of resourcing at the moment. In the latter case, we do attach some of our newer probationers to them, which gives them a real taste for that sort of work, gets them in amongst some of the youngsters who are most at risk, and I think is a really good way of giving them confidence in dealing with some quite challenging issues on the street often. But also we just have to get that balance right. We can't have too many new officers doing that sort of work because it is challenging, and they are often challenged as they're going about it.
Thank you. As I'm sure you're aware, I think it was last week or the week before, the Mayor made an announcement in relation to soft drugs like cannabis, and I think he said he was setting up some kind of commission to look at whether or not people should be arrested or whether or not people should be charged. Of course, he hasn't got any powers to do any of that, but obviously he may ask via the Deputy Mayor whether or not you should see that as a priority. What are your views on that? Do you think that would be a good thing?
So obviously the Deputy Mayor is qualified to talk about the Drugs Commission much more than I am. Suffice to say, I think that has been talked about for a little while, and whatever that consists of, within reason, if we can assist with our expertise or advice or information, then we will of course support it, just as we would if something similar was being set up by another, if there was a government-led body or something. In relation to any announcement around changing approach, we are not changing our approach, and I have no intention of doing that at the moment at all. I've always tried to be open to new initiatives, and you'll be aware that, for example, in the government's Tony Sewell-led work, there is a suggestion there in relation to young black boys that the relationship between the Met and policing and young black boys might be improved, and involvement of young black boys in the criminal justice system might be reduced if something like what I think has been being talked about might be introduced. So I'm not saying never, but I'm very clear. Nobody has spoken to me about any change. We're not making any change. We go through the processes we go through with young people on the street, which does now include community resolution as an option. But I have no hesitation in saying we are focused on drug dealing, and drug dealing includes very frequently either polydrugs, including cannabis, or is cannabis drug dealing, which is associated often with very serious violence. And that's my number one priority, so we will still be arresting people in relation to that.
Would it help if I clarified what you seem to have got slightly mixed up? Two things slightly mixed up. One is which was a manifesto commitment from May, commitment in the Mayor's manifesto to set up a drugs commission to look at the best ways of reducing the harm that cannabis the harm of cannabis. That drugs commission is being set up at the moment. We're working to set up that, and we hope to be able to make some announcements of that in the next couple of months. The second thing I think that you've got slightly, putting together was premature reporting of a possible pilot in Lewisham around the use of community resolutions for young adults, and then extra support being put in. Those are discussions that we're having. It's a very, it's very much along the lines of, we've had questions today about a pilot in the South BCU around community resolutions and extra support being put in for young people, for children, young people. This is very much along those lines. There are discussions that are being had at the moment. We all know that diversion can work, and we have other examples of where diversion is working, for example, on female offending. Those are the two things that have happened recently. Well, not recently, Mayor's Manifesto was last May. And it's really, that's ongoing discussions that we're having at the moment. There's been no decisions taken.
That's interesting.
Sorry, can I just also add, I don't want to be disrespectful in any way, but just to say, as Sophie knows, there's been no discussions with Met Management Board, which talks about early announcements of something or other. There have been no discussions between our organisations at senior levels about whether this should or shouldn't, or how it might go ahead.
I'm being looked at by the chair, so I just want to ask just one more question. Obviously, that what you're saying is true. There are two different issues, Deputy Mayor. But what's your position on drugs and soft drugs?
Beg your pardon, what's my position on what?
Soft drugs, whether or not they should be legalised, whether or not the police
Well,
should
that's
or
why
should
we've
not
set up the
prosecute.
London Drugs Commission to look at what is the best legislative
I wasn't
framework
asking-
for.
I was asking
I will wait to see
your
what the
opinion.
experts of the commission that we've set up, and we will look at what evidence they produced, the research and their recommendations around that.
So you don't have a position yourself?
I think there should be that informed debate in the way that we want to have, and we are having an informed debate, but I think actually we ought to learn lessons from abroad. We ought to think about what the best ways are to reduce the harm, to tackle violence, but also to reduce individual harm as well of cannabis. And that's why we set up the London Drugs Commission, to get that view and get the view of experts.
So you don't have a position. Thank you.
Okay, I aimed to be finished by 12:30, so I'm failing miserably. I'll leave it to Assemblymember Pigeon to make sure I don't fail too long, please. And if we could have shorter responses, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, I've got 3 questions to ask. One of them is, we've been talking about your capacity in all these complex areas, but do you feel the Met has sufficient capacity and trained staff to deal effectively with reports of online child sexual abuse and exploitation, and also the requirements that are coming down the line in the Online Harms Bill?
We have invested recently in online child sexual exploitation. As you know, we have recently put a large number of extra officers into that area because of further referrals coming in to us, and we need to do that. We have also been working very hard to improve our digital capability and create greater efficiency and put in place new tools for those officers so that their time is best spent. It's a massive challenge globally, and it's a massive challenge in the United Kingdom. We have some fantastic results all the time, not least from our online work, where we are looking at those people who may be in the online space but are also risk contact offenders potentially, who actually will want to go out and meet children and groom children on the street. And every other week we get an arrest or a charge in relation to somebody in that category. So it's a big challenge. It is one we take seriously. I wish I could say that I was confident that in the future, through better methods by others, including platform providers, the demand on us would reduce. I'm not completely confident about that, but that must be the way forward. And of course, the Online Harms Bill is very much about prevention, and it is about the responsibility of those who support the internet and the platforms in their various different ways, playing their part. Very hard to know at this stage what the extra demand may be for us from the Online Harms Bill. I thoroughly support and always have, not a political point, the sort of aims of it. And we have recently, in fact, I had a personal sort of 3-hour session with Ofcom, the lead of Ofcom and their team, about how things may work in the future And one thing that, of course, would concern us, which we want to make sure doesn't happen, is that, and I hope won't, but that providers will say, oh, we don't like the look of this, could the police have a look at it? We don't need that, thank you very much. What we need is providers saying, you can't put this sort of material up, we've got a barrier that stops it. Or as soon as it goes up, we've taken it down again, sorry. Or you keep putting the wrong stuff up, you're banned. That's what we need. We don't need an extra shunt of work to us. And that's what we're trying to achieve. But I think it must be, in broad terms, I'm not trying to predict the debate in Parliament or say anything inappropriate for a police chief, but I am very supportive of the direction of travel.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you. And then another area is around dealing with the significant rise we've seen in economic and cybercrime. What are the key challenges here? Have you the right resources and systems in place here?
So I think this is something that the committee have looked at a couple of times recently, and probably in more detail. I will always sort of defend what the Met has done in terms of investing more in this area than many other forces, and our cyber capability working with the NCA is strong. The challenges, as you know, are manifold. Firstly, volume and the increasing volume that there is out there, particularly in terms of fraud. And secondly, the fact that many of the perpetrators, by no means all, but many of the perpetrators are based overseas. So we are looking, as a country, we have to look very strongly at prevention and protection as opposed to enforcing our way out of the problem. We have some fantastic proactive money laundering teams, again, seizing record volumes of cash this year, and we have had some wonderful results in relation to economic crime. The lead, as you know, is with the City of London Police and the national agencies, and we work closely with them on policy and with government. I don't feel, as a service, proud of, I'm not talking about the Met nationally, I think many people would say, overall, our service to fraud victims is not how I would like it in an ideal world to be. But prevention and protection has to be the major focus for the future. A great deal of what happens is because, I, or perhaps even you, Caroline, are careless about our security, and it's too easy, perhaps, arguably, getting into hot water here, to just say to the bank, well, sorry, this has happened, or say to another thing, give me my money back. But we try always to look at each fraud dissemination that comes to us and see what has the harm been to an individual. So we don't just deal with the big ones. We do take very seriously where somebody's life has been wrecked by a fraud, and we will always try to bring people to justice where we can, or help others so to do.
Okay, thank you. And the final area I'm just sweeping up here is around modern slavery, and the FMS states modern slavery and human trafficking offences in London continue to rise year on year. What more can the Met be doing to safeguard victims of modern slavery?
I think I'm right in saying that actually it has stabilised a little bit very latterly. But I think probably to do with the pandemic, and it may of course be that it's become more hidden rather than less. I fully accept that. But we have the overall number of offences reported to us and investigations that we're undertaking have reduced slightly. As you know, the serious and complex ones are dealt with, and I think very well. Centrally, and we're seen by the Slavery Commissioner and others as genuinely very capable in that area, and we work very well with our international partners on those cases which involve people coming from overseas, particularly labour and sex work, and we have really good collaborative relationships with those, sadly, countries which are the most common ones of origin, not least Romania and Albania, but others as well, Nigeria as well. We have done a great deal of work with our local officers. It's been running issue. I'm sure I can remember you asking me about this probably 10 years ago, to try to improve all their knowledge. And just in recent times, thousands and thousands of officers have had more training on modern slavery and on safeguarding. County Lines has been a great example of this. I haven't gone on and on about Orochi today, but I normally do. Huge numbers of county lines closed in the last couple of years. Fantastic results. These are people who operate county lines that are out in the counties, plural, but also they're gang members here, and many of them run lines locally. We're adopting the approach that we've taken with other colleagues around the country now locally, so you'll see a real push on county lines within, it's probably the wrong word, exploitative lines within your boroughs and the BCUs in the next year. And each time the officers are working with partners. They have a good understanding of exploitation. They have a good understanding when they need to recognise that this person is exploited, not just, if you like, an offender, or sometimes not even an offender, and a good relationship with the CPS. We have some really good partners to work with, people who will always turn out at 3 in the morning. I went on one not that long ago myself, we're doing a raid on a brothel. They'll always turn out to help take care of people who wish to find a new way of life, often from overseas. Our victim navigators are very important. These are people who make a huge difference as to whether somebody will end up giving evidence or not. Some of them are ex-police officers, many not, but a really good recent initiative. And we coordinate well with other forces, but it is mostly hidden, a huge issue. And something I can say confidently my teams are much more knowledgeable about and better at, particularly, not least, the safeguarding aspects of it, but more to do, of course.
Lovely, thank you very much.
Thank you. Assembly Member Boff, only if it is very quick. And one answer, please, Commissioner, to whatever it is.
I am the most unpopular Assembly Member in this room for coming in at the end, but the granting of leave to remain is a really important tool to encourage victims of human trafficking to come forward and indeed to dissuade them from, to prevent them from being just sent back home where they're re-trafficked. Do you maintain figures on how often the leave to remain has been offered to victims of human trafficking? You can say I'll write to you. That would be fine. You can say I'll write to you because I'm very conscious.
I don't know that we do. I'm not sure that it is something I can find for the Met, but if I can find it, I would of course want to.
Thank you very much. And
Thanks.
just to re-emphasise, you can't expect people to come forward if they're victims.
Yes.
If they're then told as soon as they come forward, they're going to be sent back to the place they tried to escape from.
You will understand that the responsibility doesn't lie with us.
Yeah, but it's something that the Met can offer. But I'll leave it there. Thank you, sir.
It's
Thank
a fair
you,
point. Okay, thank you very much. That concludes the questioning. And I'd like to thank our guests very much for attending this morning and for the answers to our questions. Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the report, the discussion and the monthly report received from MOPAC? Can we also delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from this meeting? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the work programme? Thank you. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 2nd of February 2022 at 10 a.m. in the London Fire Brigade headquarters, which is indeed where we are in Union Street. I have no other urgent business, so it concludes today's meeting.